Apple just announced a new line of MacBook Pro laptops that addressed a long-standing list of complaints. But as they made the screen bigger, they added a notch without any Face ID sensor on it. This might be a bit confusing, so in this video we're going to look at why Apple might have made a decision to add a notch to the MacBook Pros without having a Face ID sensor. So I want to start out by talking about why Face ID doesn't exist on this year's laptops. There are only two possible reasons why. Number one, Apple chose deliberately not to focus on Face ID this year, or number two, that they did choose to focus on it, but ended up running into some kind of a technical limitation that forced their hand into pushing the feature out to another iteration. First, let's talk about the topic of Apple deliberately choosing not to focus on Face ID this year. Now, typically when people hear that Apple deliberately didn't include a feature in a specific year, they jump cynically to the conclusion that, oh, these crooks, they have it ready and they're just not willing to release it so that they can get me to buy the next iteration next year. Now, we won't really know what the real motivations are looking on the outside, but as an engineering manager who has come across a few of these decisions, I can shed some light on typically how these decisions get made. So it goes something like this. Let's say there are 100 potential customers who are willing to buy the new MacBook Pro with all of the features that they just announced, plus Face ID. Now imagine if I were to remove Face ID from that list of features. I now need to think about how many customers out of that 100 do I end up losing because I didn't add Face ID this year. So if I were in anybody else's shoes, and I would think you would also arrive at the same guess, is that number would not be much. That means not a lot of people would choose to say, I'll skip on this year because there is no Face ID this year. On the other hand, if I have 20 engineers on my team who are working on the new MacBook Pro, the exact same MacBook Pro that you saw Apple announce just a few days ago, with, let's just say there were 10 new features, I then need to make a decision along the lines of, should I add this 11th new feature, Face ID, in the mix, knowing that Face ID or the lack of Face ID is not going to stop people from buying the laptop? Should I risk detracting from the focus of those 20 engineers on the 10 features by adding an 11th feature? In other words, add 11 features instead of the 10, assuming 10 is what got announced by Apple. I will be compromising somewhere or another on the focus, on the quality, or maybe on the deadline, because the number of people who can work on this project are limited. And so this is how I would arrive at a decision to not focus on Face ID this year and maybe look it up in another iteration, because it's not like I have this feature just lying around and I'm choosing to say, let me not add it this year, let me add it in the next year, and that year's laptops become better. Instead, it is a cost-benefit analysis of, if I choose to add this feature this year, what am I trading off instead of that? Face ID is pretty cool technology, but it doesn't offer any benefits in terms of functionality over what Touch ID doesn't already give you. And as we already saw, there are not a lot of people who choose to say, I'm not going to buy this year's laptop because it doesn't have Face ID. As we've seen, they have plenty of excellent features that a lot of people have already been asking for. So not having Face ID, I don't think would be much of a deterrent for people who are already in the market looking for a new MacBook Pro laptop. Now, the next possibility is Apple just ran into some sort of engineering challenges trying to put in Face ID into this year's laptop. Now, looking from the outside, it's very difficult to know what might have been the actual technical limitation that got them to say, let's not do Face ID this year. However, if you look at it purely from a planning perspective, and let's go back to our example of, say, 1 out of 20 engineers who's working on Face ID. If you realize early on, and typically you realize these problems early on in the development cycle, that Face ID is not going to make it in the next X months, whatever it might be. It might be 13 months, 14 months, whatever, we don't know. But if you realize that we're not going to be able to make it because of whatever the engineering challenge I'm facing is, as somebody who is planning the release, the smart thing to do would be to say, okay, let's skip out on Face ID. let's make a subpar camera system, and by subpar I mean purely a camera system which doesn't have Face ID, all of the other upgrades still being present, and include that instead, because we know already that that would take either less time or already has been figured out. So that is another reason why you would just choose to say, let's not do Face ID this year because of the technical limitations we're running into, and then buy ourselves some more time because now we have another iteration or maybe a couple of iterations to go during which we can figure out Face ID. But none of this still answers the question, if Face ID doesn't exist in the MacBook that we just saw Apple announce, why is there a notch? Because a notch exists on the iPhone and we typically think Face ID exists there and it's an edge-to-edge display. That's the reason why the notch is there. But there is no Face ID on the MacBook Pros, so why the notch? For this one, I'm fairly confident that the answer is planning and just thinking ahead. So let's consider this. We both, you and I, know that Face ID is going to be a thing on the Mac. You know it, I know it, the people at Apple know it. Call up anybody who doesn't even know what Apple's plans are and they would at least ask the question why there is no Face ID, because it just seems obvious that it would end up there, right? So now let's consider this. Imagine if the laptops that Apple announced just a couple of days ago didn't have a notch and instead they had a hole punch, or they had whatever your favorite widget of including a camera in there might have been. Let's say that is the laptop that they announced on Monday. And let's assume that the Face ID based MacBook Pros come in 2022. Let's say it's 2022, 2023, doesn't matter. What do you think the engineering team, the hardware team is supposed to do between 2021 and 2022? Are they going to spend all of that time yet again redesigning the camera housing on the laptop? Because they just spent a lot of while doing that. They went from the Intel based MacBooks, which had, they didn't really have a notch. They had just the rectangular edge at the top where the camera was housed. And they spent probably a lot of time re-engineering that to instead have a notch on the hardware. So if they didn't have a notch, let's say they just had a hole punch, just because, that's one that I'm familiar with. If they had a hole punch in 2021, what do they do in 2022? Do they spend all of that time re-engineering the hardware yet again to now accommodate for a notch when Face ID will come in there? It's not just the hardware, it's also the software, because you need to tailor your software on the device that it is running on. It's all the testing cost that goes into making something like this, where you need to check your latest versions of macOS with the latest versions of your Mac laptops, and then you need to make sure that the hole punch version is accounted for in the following versions of macOS, and now the new notch version is accounted for, and it's just a messy situation which honestly is just best avoided, especially when you know that Face ID will be coming in only a year or maximum 2 years of time. Why not instead specify the specifications of the camera housing and set it in stone so that when Face ID comes, you don't need to retest all the layout and redesign the camera housing yet again, and you save yourself all of the hassles that come along in the process. Because keep in mind that hardware engineering benefits a lot from stability in the requirements, where software is more or slightly more malleable to the requirements changing as time goes along. This is purely because there are a lot of moving parts in hardware engineering as opposed to software engineering. Let me give you an example. Do you remember when the iPhone X was announced, they ended up switching a lot of their iconography in the software in iOS to denote a phone as being an icon of a phone with a notch as opposed to the one with the home button. You can still see this to this date in the App Store, where you need to double click the side button to confirm purchases. There you will see that the iPhone's icon has the notch in the iconography. This is one such example where this sort of forward thinking really helps. Now imagine if the first iteration of the iPhone X, they didn't have Face ID and instead they had a hole punch display. Imagine the Face ID came in iPhone XS. Do you really think that they would end up going back to the drawing board and replacing all that iconography? They could. It's not impossible, but you can just save yourself the work. Imagine if the iPhone X didn't have Face ID. You could save yourself the work by including the notch, not having Face ID in there, and then if theoretically when iPhone XS would have added it, they would add the Face ID in the same notch and in the same housing for the camera area, and things would be fine. So that's been it for me. I hope you got something out of this video and just got a general sense of the sort of thinking that goes behind making and releasing a product and how you can choose to add or not add features to one iteration as opposed to another. That's been it for me. Until next time.